You open an investment account for the first time. Everything on the screen looks very simple. Just a few numbers moving up and down. A few familiar buttons. Buy, sell, confirm. At a glance, it feels like you already understand everything. But the feeling inside is completely different. There's a bit of unfamiliarity, a bit of hesitation, and a feeling that's hard to name, as if you're stepping into something bigger than yourself. You transfer in an amount of money. Not enough to get the market's attention, but to you, it matters. Enough to make you start paying attention. Enough that even small movements begin to hold your focus a little longer. And for the first time, you have a very clear thought. That maybe you don't always have to trade your time for money. That maybe money can operate on its own. The idea is subtle, but it stays. And from there, it's very easy to imagine a path. A journey where you gradually gain control over your finances, where you have more options, more room to breathe, a different version of life. But there is something you haven't seen yet. Opening your account is not when you start the game. It's simply the moment you step inside a system that already existed and operates on logics you don't truly understand yet. In that system, the same action can lead to completely different outcomes. Not because the action is right or wrong, but because your position within the system is different. And there's something else you haven't realized. This game doesn't stay still. It changes. Not loudly, no announcements. It simply shifts quietly as you move up each level. This is not a video about profits, not about what you should buy, not about how to optimize a few extra percentage points. This is about how the game of investing changes shape as your capital scale changes. At first, you're just trying to understand what's happening. Then you learn to stay disciplined so you don't get pushed out of the game. Then, at some point, you begin to see money operating over time, slowly but clearly. But there will be a point where everything no longer looks the same. You're not just investing. You begin to gain access to things you couldn't see before. Then, you begin to own. Then, you begin to decide where money goes. And at some level, you're no longer just reacting to the market. You begin to influence it. At every level, the rules change. The pressure changes. The way you think changes. And the reward is no longer what you originally thought. There is no single correct way to invest for everyone. There are only different games being played at different levels. And if you don't realize that, you will keep using a lower level mindset to navigate a system that has already changed. The first level is not about money. It's about how you see the world. The first level happens very quietly. Nothing really explodes. You're no longer outside, you're inside. You buy an asset. You open the app more often. You start looking at prices, not just to see them, but to feel them. Every small movement has meaning. A small rise, you feel good. A small drop, you feel uneasy. At this stage, what you really have is not profit. It's attention. You read more than before, watch more videos, listen to more opinions, and often react faster than necessary. A piece of news appears, and you feel like you need to do something immediately. A movement happens, and you think you've missed something. The feeling of needing to act shows up very frequently. Your confidence comes and goes quickly. There are moments when you think you're starting to understand. But the moment the market shifts slightly, everything becomes uncertain again. You think you're learning how to invest, but in reality, you're learning how to react to uncertainty. And that is the limit of this level. Because here, you don't truly control anything. You're being pulled along, not by your own logic. but by the rhythm of information around you. News, opinions, the crowd. And at some point, you begin to feel tired of it. Not because there isn't enough information, but because there's too much. And at that moment, a different need appears. You don't need more data. You need a structure. The next level doesn't feel like a breakthrough. From the outside, it even looks more boring. You no longer chase opportunities every day. You no longer check constantly to decide what to do next. You begin to do something much simpler. You invest consistently. The same action repeated over time, regardless of whether the market is excited or unstable. On the surface, there's nothing exciting. No big wins, no feeling of perfect timing. But if you look closely, something is changing. Your behavior becomes more stable. You're no longer pulled by every small movement. You begin to develop your own rhythm. A small system created by you. And that, in itself, creates a new kind of pressure. When the market drops, you must continue. Not because you're certain, but because the system requires it. When the market rises, you must also continue. Not breaking discipline just because emotions feel good. Discipline is no longer a choice. It's the condition for you to stay in the game. But even when you do everything right, a limitation still exists. Everything you build still depends on your income. You still have to add more for the system to grow. You are contributing. The system is not yet self-sustaining. And at some point, you begin to realize something. Scale starts to matter. The next level doesn't come from a clear decision. It comes from time. One day you open your account and pause longer than usual. Not because you just added more money, but because you see the numbers moving on their own. Not much, but enough to notice. Your money is no longer standing still. It begins to have its own movement. This is the first time you truly feel the concept of compounding. Not in theory, but inside your own account. A small percentage is no longer abstract. It's a real number. When the market rises, you see it clearly. When the market falls, you feel it quickly. Confidence begins to form. But along with it comes something else. You begin to worry. Not because you don't have, but because you now have and could lose. You're no longer just thinking about making more. You're thinking about keeping what you have. Every decision becomes heavier. It's no longer experimentation. No longer, let's see what happens. You begin to consider more carefully, more slowly. But even though your scale has changed, you still realize something. You don't truly control the outcome. You still depend on what the market gives. You don't yet have enough leverage to create a significant difference. And when you realize that, the way you look at your portfolio begins to change. The next level is not about you earning more. It's about you starting to see things differently. You no longer look at your portfolio as separate investments, no longer as individual positions, individual decisions, isolated buy and sell actions. You begin to see it as a system, a structure with multiple components. Each part has its own role, and everything is interconnected. You think about weightings, about allocation, about how if one part changes, how the entire system will respond. You begin to consider not just returns, but also risk. Not just what you can gain, but what you could lose. On the surface, things seem clearer. You have a plan, principles, a framework for making decisions. But at the same time, another layer of complexity appears. More variables to track, more factors to consider, and sometimes, too many. A paradox begins to form. the more you try to optimize, the easier it is to fall into over-adjusting. You start questioning your own system. Should you tweak it a little more? Are you missing any opportunities? The sense of control is real, but it's not absolute, because one thing hasn't changed. You are still operating inside a system you didn't create. The larger rules are still out of your reach. You are still in the public market, where everyone sees the same things and reacts in similar ways. And that is the limit. If you look back at the first 4 levels, everything seems very different. But in reality, they share one very clear common point. You are learning how to survive within the system, to understand it, to adapt to it, and to avoid mistakes that could push you out of the game. You become better, more disciplined, more stable, but you are still playing by someone else's rules. And then, at a certain point, something begins to change. Not how you invest, but how the system begins to respond to you. Things that didn't appear before start to appear. Doors that were once closed begin to open. Not loudly, no announcements, just the way things gradually start treating you differently. And when that happens, you move into another stage. At this stage, you begin to receive things that weren't there before. Opportunities that don't appear publicly. Offers from people you've never worked with before. You get introduced, connected, invited into things you couldn't see before. Not because you suddenly became better, but because you meet the criteria. Your scale has reached a threshold that the system begins to recognize. And from there, another layer opens. You begin to access private investments, more complex structures, deals that require time and trust. But along with that comes a different kind of risk. No longer as transparent as before. No longer easy to exit when needed. You have to trust other people more. Trust structures you don't fully control. The feeling at this point is quite strange. You are invited inside, but not always certain whether you should go further. And that is the limit of this level. You have access, but not control. As you go further, the way you operate begins to change more clearly. You no longer manage money as an individual. You begin to build a structure around it. It could be a legal entity. It could be a system of advisors. It could be clear processes for each decision. You no longer make decisions in isolation. Everything is considered within a larger framework. Return, risk, liquidity, time. Each element has its place. But as everything becomes more structured, the pressure increases along with it. Mistakes are no longer small. An incorrect decision can leave long-lasting consequences. You begin to feel your responsibility more clearly, not just for the outcomes, but for the entire system you are operating. And there are times when the number of decisions to be made becomes too many. You have to think more, slower, more carefully. But even though you've built a system, a limitation still remains. You are still reacting to opportunities. You are not yet creating them. And when you cross that threshold, another shift happens. You no longer wait for opportunities to appear, you begin to shape them. You decide where capital flows, who receives funding, which strategies get supported. You're not just investing in one thing. You allocate across many, not to experiment, but to direct. At this scale, each decision is no longer personal. It has impact, not immediately, but enough to create influence over time. And with that comes a very different feeling. You have more power, but less freedom. You can't move as quickly as before. You can't change your mind easily. Everything takes time. requires calculation, requires consideration of consequences. And sometimes, that feeling is isolating. You no longer see things the way you used to. But there aren't many people around you at the same level to share it with. And even here, there is still a limit. You can influence, but you are still operating within a larger framework. At the highest level, the difference is no longer about what you invest in. It's about creating the conditions for the market to operate. You take part in major decisions, long-term structures, changes that don't happen in days or weeks, but over years. Your influence is no longer a byproduct. It becomes part of the system. But along with that, something else appears. You are no longer invisible. Every move is observed. Every decision has broader consequences. You can no longer move freely as before. And even at this position, there are still larger structures you cannot fully control. At the lower levels, you try to be right, to choose better, faster, more precisely. You see the market as something to beat, a problem to solve. And for a long time, that perspective seems reasonable. But when you look from above, the picture changes completely. Those at the top don't spend most of their time tracking every small movement. They don't optimize individual decisions. They look at flows, where money goes, how long it stays, what structures it sits in. At the bottom, money is something you try to earn more of. At the top, money becomes capital. Capital is not just a number. It is something that can be structured, preserved, allocated with intention. When capital is large enough, the question is no longer what to buy. It becomes where to place it and why. And from there, another layer opens. Allocation at sufficient scale begins to create influence. Not immediately, but over time. One decision can support a direction or slow another down. And when influence becomes large enough, it is no longer a side effect of investing. It becomes the objective. From money to capital. From capital to allocation. From allocation to influence. And ultimately, to structure. Structure determines what is encouraged, what is constrained, where capital flows, even when no one is actively trying to control it. At the bottom, you try to keep up with the market. At the top, the market moves, within frameworks that were shaped beforehand. And at this point, investing is no longer about selecting assets. It is part of how the system allocates power. What remains is not about climbing faster, not about trying to reach the highest level. Each level gives you a different kind of freedom. And at the same time, takes something else away. At the bottom, you have less control, but you have simplicity. At the top, you have more influence. But you are constrained by your own scale. There is no perfect level, only different trade-offs. And what matters is not where you are, but whether you understand which game you are in. Because once you begin to see the structure, you no longer react blindly. You begin to move with intention, not rushed, not delusional, just clearly understanding how the system operates.